Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning into this Living New Deal webinar, The Federal Theater, Democracy, and the Making of a Culture War. I'm Susan Ives. The Living New Deal is a Berkeley-based nonprofit that works to preserve the New Deal's legacy. We teach about what the New Deal did for our country during the crisis of the Great Depression. Our website, livingnewdeal.org, is a resource for New Deal history, politics, policies, and people. Our online interactive map shows what the New Deal built. Much is still in use today. Volunteers send us their New Deal discoveries, and through this crowdsourcing effort, we've documented nearly 20,000 New Deal sites, and we believe we've just scratched the surface of what the New Deal left to all of us. We welcome your support. When FDR ran for president in 1932, unemployment was at 25%. People had lost their livelihoods, their savings, their homes. FDR promised them a New Deal. Upon taking office in 1933, he launched programs offering jobs and relief. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, begun in 1935, was one such program. The WPA hired workers not only to build roads and bridges, schools, libraries, civic buildings, and public works. It also hired artists, musicians, writers, actors, and others in the performing arts. During its 4 years existence, the Federal Theater performed before millions of Americans until Congress revoked its funding in 1939. Tonight, we are pleased to present two outstanding authors to talk about the rise and fall of the Federal Theater and the parallels to today. James Shapiro teaches English at Columbia University in New York. He is a Shakespeare Scholar and serves on the board of the UK's Royal Shakespeare Company. He is author of several books. His most recent is The Playbook, a story of theater, democracy, and the making of a culture war. He's received the New Deal Book Award for 2024. Award-winning author Susan Quinn has written several books about strong women. Eleanor Roosevelt, Lorena Hickok, Marie Curie, and Hallie Flanagan among them. Hallie, the embattled director of the Federal Theater Project, is the focus of Susan's 2008 book, Furious Improvisation: How the WPA and a Cast of Thousands Made High Art Out of Desperate Times. Congressional hearings held by the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, on the Federal Theater Project inspired the play It Can Happen Here, co-written by Susan and Dan Jacobs. It was performed earlier this year by the New Perspectives Theater Company in New York City. Today's webinar salutes the 90th anniversary of the WPA Federal Theater Project and the spirit of government that inspired it. Thank you for joining us, and welcome, James and Susan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm really delighted to be here. The New Deal is a program that mattered then and matters now. And I'm also delighted to share the stage tonight, so to speak, with Susan Quinn, who is one of the great writers about the Federal Theater Project, especially about Hallie Flanagan. Let me begin by spelling out in 10 minutes or so what the argument of my book is. And I might as well begin with the title, The Playbook. Originally, I just wanted to call it Playbook, but a friend and critic, Fintan O'Toole, the Irish literary critic, told me, call it The Playbook. And there's a pun involved in the title because for those of you who work in the theater, you know that playbooks are books containing dramatic scripts. But nowadays, when we think of a playbook, we think of a political playbook, the kind that's employed in taking down your adversaries. So my book, The Playbook, is about the Federal Theater and its playbooks, but also the House Un-American Activities Committee, and the Playbook that destroyed the federal theater. And the book tries to address both of these forces in equal measure. The collision of two federal entities, only one could survive. So there's a bit of drama in the telling of that story. As Susan rightly noted in the beginning, the Federal Theater was a New Deal project, and it was part of the WPA, the Work Progress Administration, which did everything from build roads and highways and carving out hiking trails in Colorado to painting murals in libraries to providing books on every state through the Federal Writers Project and bringing theater to Americans. And it was bringing theater to Americans in the mid 1930s at a time when theater had almost been wiped out by the rise of film in the previous decades. So when the Federal Theater was created, there were many, many theater artists, actors, directors, stagehands, designers, ushers who had been put out of business in the previous decades. The Federal Theater was a work program, but it was a work program in which people who were artists weren't handed picks and shovels, but they were allowed to practice what they excelled at, some of whom had been old vaudevillians, some of whom, like the great stars of the Federal Theater, the young Arthur Miller, the young Orson Welles, cut their teeth in the theater world through the Federal Theater Project. It's hard from our vantage point 90 years later to consider how extraordinary this venture was. From 1935 until 1939, when it was shut down, the Federal Theater Project staged over 1,000 productions in 29 states. Those 29 states still had actors and directors they could marshal since this was a federal and not a national theater. It had to be done state by state. And in those 29 states, plays were seen by 30 million Americans, or roughly one in every four. And two-thirds of them, and surveys showed this, had never seen a live play before. The Federal Theater brought children's plays on trucks to schoolyards in crowded cities. It staged works in foreign languages, Italian, Spanish, German, and Yiddish, to reach immigrant populations that couldn't understand plays in English. It established what it called Negro units, a score of them from Hartford, Connecticut to Seattle, Washington, to support Black actors and playwrights. It brought theater to asylums, to orphanages, to hospitals, to prisons, to veterans' homes. It revived playgoing in rural states where people hadn't seen plays in decades. And 10 million listeners tuned in every week to listen to its radio broadcasts. Its very success led to its demise because there was a hunger at that time for drama that spoke to that unsettling moment, political, social, and especially economic, in the 1930s. One of the arguments of my book is that when we look back to when this country was really torn apart by culture wars, we tend to look at the 1960s. Most people who write about the culture wars see the Vietnam War and see the rise of the civil rights movement, feminism, and other forces in the 1960s as the source of the divisions today. I'm making a different argument in this book that we need to go back further. We need to look at the 1930s, a time much like our own of economic uncertainty, of racial tension, of rising nationalism and fascism, with new technologies transforming how people, Americans, experience the news and entertainment. And this was also a moment, a rare moment in American history where progressives found their voice and argued for the kind of social reforms that led to FDR's New Deal and the WPA. That's the happy side of the story because at its peak, the Federal Theater employed some 12,000 unemployed theater folk. Again, most weren't famous, but it brought them together, and they were brought together under the leadership of somebody Susan and I will talk, I hope, a good deal about, the remarkable theater professor, Hallie Flanagan, of Vassar College, who was asked by Roosevelt to oversee this vast theater program. Those of you with any familiarity with running a theater know that putting together a season of 3 or 4 plays is nightmarish. Hallie Flanagan had to put together theater in dozens of cities and towns round the clock for this 4 year period. And I don't think anybody has ever tackled as much in this country or in any country in terms of providing theater for a nation than Hallie Flanagan. The other half of my book tells a sadder story, Susan, in introducing this book of the rise and the fall of the Federal Theater. The Federal Theater was taken down by the House Un-American Activities Committee, which had just been formed and had appointed as its head Martin Dies, an aggressive, charismatic, and bigoted uh, congressman from Texas, 2nd Congressional District, a seat his father had held before him. He was incredibly ambitious. He understood how to use the media. He had no difficulty using playing the race card when he needed to, and he developed a playbook, which those of you who follow Congress on a daily or weekly basis will be very familiar with. It began more or less with Martin Dies. And many of us think of the House Un-American Committee and the hounding of progressives and those on the left as a feature of the early 1950s and Joe McCarthy in the Senate. This began earlier in the 30s in Congress under the leadership of Martin Dies, who understood that his short-lived committee was only given a few months to file a report. His congressional leaders were suspicious of the ambitious young congressman, and Dies wanted to continue and rise in popularity in the United States. And in the end, the House Un-American Activities Committee lasted until 1975, and the Federal Theater Project died in 1939. And the premise of my book is imagining an America where the opposite would have been true, where the House Un-American Activities Committee would have folded in early 1939, and we would still have a federal theater. I'll stop there, open it up for Susan's conversation, and then later to your questions.
Thank you for that excellent summary. Um, I got involved with writing a book about the Federal Theater at a much more hopeful time in our recent history. It was 2000, 2009, 8 and 9, and that was just the end of the George W. Bush presidency, but the beginning of the Obama years. Um, and I was attracted to the story at first because of Hallie Flanagan, the director. I thought in the beginning I was going to write a biography. That has been my work. I'm a biographer, and I've chosen to write biographies of strong women, and she was one of them. But as time went on, it became clear to me and to people who helped me with putting my books together that I needed to broaden the story, and it really needed to be the story of the Federal Theater with Hallie Flanagan as its absolutely central character. And I think we agree, James and I, that she was remarkable. She was the first woman to get a Guggenheim Fellowship. And she used it to go to England and Europe and to really encounter and learn from all of the greatest um, theater writers and directors of the time. She most controversial, went to Russia and met Meyerhold and Stanislavski. She met Pirandello in Italy. She met the stars of the British stage and of the French stage. And she was a woman of tremendous energy with a really kind of tragic past. She married young. She went to Grinnell College, which was important because Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's right-hand man, also went to Grinnell College, and that was how he knew about Hallie Flanagan. But Hallie after Grinnell, married quickly out of college, but her husband had TB and died within a few years. Then she came back home to Grinnell, and her older of two sons died suddenly of meningitis. So a tremendous loss and pain. But out of that, she discovered that the theater was really going to be her salvation. And that's a complicated story because, like many women and many parents, there was a great divide about whether she should stay home and take care of her surviving child or whether she should pursue this life in the theater. And she chose the theater, and uh, the son suffered as a result. But and that's a personal story. But she was a tremendously effective teacher and director at Vassar, and did some original work there. I think, as James pointed out in his book, she was a talented director, but she was an even more talented um, organizer of people, like even more amazingly original about how to really make this federal theater work. And she was faced with these very various people with various talents, and she put them to work in a very short amount of time, and had some failures in the beginning, but then soon after began to have some successes. And maybe, James, maybe you talk interestingly about the first success. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about Voodoo Macbeth.
Yeah, I love talking about Hallie Flanagan, especially with somebody who gets Hallie Flanagan.
Yeah.
And I should share with the members of the audience. I'm a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which admits living members. And last year they decided there must be people who they did not admit, who deserved to be in this canon of great Americans who contributed to arts and letters. And I submitted her name, and she was not admitted. And I got a note this past week saying, we're going to put his name in again.
Uh,
I wrote back and I said, Hallie Flanagan is not a man. She was the greatest theater leader in America, but Hallie was a she. And an apologetic note came back, but
no change in the decision.
we'll see this year. I'm going to be persistent because I owe it to Hallie Flanagan and
Absolutely.
anybody working in the theater. She's just not known. You know her well. You know her life, her tragic
Yeah.
life. But this
Yeah.
was somebody who could have spent a career as a successful academic and decided to take a leap. And
Mhm.
uh, Roosevelt, FDR, did not want to hand over this project to a New York producer. He wanted somebody Midwestern born who had tremendous people skills and organizational
Yeah.
skills. And Hallie Flanagan was the one. And
Yeah.
Harry Hopkins knew it and handpicked her. And she more than delivered on what was an impossible task.
Yeah.
Uh,
Really impossible.
the first great hit
Yeah.
was Macbeth. And it was a hit because of a previous failure. The uh, the Federal Theater was going to kick things off with a major production about the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. And when the State Department caught wind of this, they just shut it down. And it upset Hallie Flanagan because she was worried. Hallie had exacted a promise from Harry Hopkins, no censorship, no meddling from DC.
Yeah.
And from the get-go, there was meddling. So the first great,
Free, adult, and uncensored. He
that is it.
his promise.
He promised in Iowa in front of a large crowd. Those
Yeah.
were his words.
Yeah.
And of course, real politics came into the story quite early. The Lafayette Theater in Harlem, about a mile from where I'm sitting right now, hosted 170 actors, black actors, doing a production of Macbeth, uh, which was incredible. And it was directed by somebody who had never directed a professional play before, a 20-year-old white kid named Orson Welles. And it was a hit. It sold out in New York and it was so successful. Hallie Flanagan decided to book a train and send it to Indianapolis, send it all the way to Dallas, Texas. You can imagine at a festival in Dallas, Texas, 170 black actors in Jim Crow, Texas, where blacks could not vote, putting on a play like this. So it was an early example of both the promise of the Federal Theater and the threat to many in this country who all of a sudden saw blacks doing Shakespeare in incredible and innovative ways. And a lot of people in America, then as now, were not prepared for this. But that was the kind of breakthrough moment for the Federal Theater Project, and Hallie Flanagan was riding pretty high at that point.
Yeah. And we can just imagine that Martin Dies of the House Un-American Activities would be threatened by an all-black, tremendously successful production traveling across the country.
It was only one black congressman at this time from the Chicago area.
Yeah.
And Martin Dies, when he ran for office in Texas, threatened to punch him in the nose and called out his wife for accepting an invitation to join other congressional wives for tea at the
Yeah.
White House.
Yeah. Yeah. So thinking about what um, sort of stirs up reaction then and now, um, I was thinking about uh, the way in which Trump has reacted to humor right from the beginning. It has been said that had Obama not mocked him at the correspondence dinner when he was running for office, maybe Trump wouldn't have felt he had to fight back and run. But also in the story of the Federal Theater, there were similar kinds of events. Was one very famous one that maybe we could talk about, and that was the senator from Alabama, Joe Starnes, um, interrogating Hallie Flanagan at the hearings about the communist influence in the Federal Theater Project and the dangerous way
Sure.
in which it had invaded the project. And he famously said to her, she'd written an essay in which she talked about the workers' theater. And she said that the workers' theater's ambitions were in themselves a kind of Marlowe-esque madness. And so Joe Starnes, in interrogating her, said, "Now, you talked about this fellow Marlowe. Was he a communist?" And Hallie Flanagan's reaction at that point was alarm, because she realized her response was going to be very embarrassing to him. But so she said, first of all, she didn't believe that he was asking this, but finally she said, Christopher Marlowe was the most important playwright in the period immediately preceding Shakespeare. And of course, the entire audience for this hearing, broke up in laughter, mocking laughter, and it was covered in all the papers, and it became a source of real humiliation for Joe Starnes, who obviously didn't know his literary history.
Well,
And
part of the
it
part
was
of the
even mentioned in his obituary, the question about Christopher Marlowe. But that was an example of the kind of distrust and alienation that she faced in the House Un-American Activities Committee.
One of the main sources, I wrote this book during COVID, which meant it was hard to gain access to archives, National Archives and others were mostly closed at this time, and I had to get librarians to send me materials. But anybody listening can log on to the congressional testimony that Susan's referring to and look up the congressional debate and testimony for December 6, 1938, when Hallie Flanagan was finally allowed to defend her project before Martin Dies, Joe Starnes, and the other members of the House Un-American Activities Committee. And it was the first and only time in the history of our country that the purpose of theater and its place in an American democracy was debated. And it's an extraordinary exchange. It could be a play in and of itself,
Yeah.
one after another, these men who had no understanding of how to deal with an articulate, successful, confident woman,
Yeah.
tried to attack Flanagan and really failed miserably. Joe Starnes embarrassing himself the most.
Yeah.
None of these men really had any understanding of theater, and they didn't understand, and this is another argument of my book, that theater and democracy were twin born in ancient Greece. You can't really have democracy without an
Mm-hmm.
independent theater, and you can't
Mm-hmm.
have an independent theater outside of a democracy. So when
Mm-hmm.
Donald Trump has taken over the Kennedy Center in DC,
Yeah.
which he now refers to as the Trump Kennedy or Kennedy Trump Theater, you are seeing not only a threat to the kind of productions which those in Washington were used to seeing, but a
Mm-hmm.
deliberate threat to democracy
Mm-hmm.
itself. And that's what's
Yeah.
at stake.
Yeah. And the frustrating thing for Hallie was that there was no interest on the part of these congressmen in seeing any of the plays or informing themselves, you know. So this is another parallel with current times. Um, the sort of well, a lot of disinformation being allowed to just kind of thrive in those hearings and in general now we're facing a similar situation. Now
Yeah,
they've
I wouldn't, we don't need to romanticize the Congress of the past. If you keep reading this congressional testimony, you see one congressman after another read what sound to them like salacious titles,
yeah, yeah.
play after play,
Right, right.
as if that describes the content of plays by Congreve and Dryden and other
Right.
playwrights who
and
had racy
and
titles.
yeah, and O'Neill and Shaw and uh yeah. So and they found these really terribly dishonest witnesses and brought them forth with kind of, I think, the disinformation that we're wrestling with now was it was there in the HERAC hearings. They found
Yeah.
one woman who worked in the mailroom at Hallie Flanagan's office and who was secretly um, taking notes and um, spying on her, and then testified that she was a communist, definitely a communist, you know, and no way of or no refuting of these arguments by, you know, there was no opposition.
No, it was rigged in that way. Hazel Huffman has much to answer for, the woman you are describing. One of the great things about the Federal Theater, and you've written about many of these in your book, was the large scale living newspaper productions. The Federal Theater did not want to put on plays with two or three or four actors. They needed to get as many actors involved as possible. And they did these large scale productions, some of which were devoted to pressing national issues like the rise of fascism or substandard housing or medical issues, power, and the like. But one of the greatest productions of the Federal Theater was based on a novel by Sinclair Lewis. It Can Happen Here. I love that title because you have followed that up more recently with a play, It Can Happen Here. So I'd love to hear why you chose that title and what your thoughts are about that earlier play, It Can't Happen Here.
Well, yeah. The time, I think the reason that there was interest in doing the play and that the New Perspectives Theater signed on to it was that we are in a similar time. And Sinclair Lewis was writing about what he perceived to be the right-wing fascistic movement in the United States. And he was married to a woman named Dorothy Thompson, who was really one of the first reporters to interview Hitler and come back and report about him and report about what was happening to Jews in Germany. And he soaked up her information and turned it into this play. I don't know what you think of the play. I have to admit, I don't think that that it's a very good play.
It's a terrible play. It
Yeah,
got panned, but it did something for the federal
it
theater.
absolutely did. I couldn't agree more, and
It wasn't, most plays, all the plays really, the federal theater, until it can't happen here, opened in one city. And if they were successful, they would be reproduced across the country. But Hallie Flanagan and her staff decided to do something unprecedented in American theater history with Sinclair Lewis's play. They were going to do it in 20 or more cities, all opening the same night.
yeah,
And this was pushing back against the film industry, which could show the same movie and still does show the
yeah,
same
yeah,
film in
yeah,
theaters opening across the land. What happens if you could do a play that opened in New York and Boston and Hartford, that was in Spanish in Florida, in Yiddish in Brooklyn, all opening the same night? And it
yeah,
was a marvelous experiment. It was never repeated. It was very complicated to do. Uh, but it spoke to the potential of what this federal theater could do that theater before or since has never quite risen to. And that's
yeah.
another tribute to Hallie Flanagan.
Hallie Flanagan. It was a brilliant publicity um, ploy, I thought. And because of course the name of the play is It Can't Happen Here, and now it's happening all at once in these different places in all these different languages. Um, and as you say, that in itself was a triumph. Um, and Hallie, I love the story of Hallie on opening night going first for the first act. She went to the New York production in English um, with Sinclair Lewis, and then the second half she went I think must have gone over to Brooklyn to the Yiddish production. The response, I think, maybe you know more about this, but I know in New York, I think it was tremendously enthusiastic. The people were very moved and um, very, standing up and shouting and cheering. And then,
And
and at the end of the New York production, Sinclair Lewis was asked to come up on the stage and make a speech, and he stood up there, and they said, "Say something, say something." He said, I've already said, I've already said it.
yeah, he'd been making a speech for the last 2 hours.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
At
Yeah.
the Yiddish theater, any number of people passed out, fainted,
Yeah. Yeah.
because this play was showing the horrors of concentration
Right.
camps
Right.
before Americans were really
Really.
aware of it. And there were
Yes.
refugees from Germany in the audience, and
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
very strong stuff.
Right. Who had seen and lived through the horror.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So this was timely theater. It was topical theater.
Yeah.
Yes, they did Christmas plays, they did Moliere, they did Shakespeare, but they
Did
didn't
lots of
flinch.
puppetry for children, some wonderful puppet shows.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
And one thing that we might add, and this is an important footnote to the story, because the Federal Theater was shut down so quickly in August 1st or the end of July when the budgetary year ended in DC in 1939, all the materials were quickly gathered up and sent to the Library of Congress, which shipped them off, and they basically forgot
yeah.
where.
Yeah.
Decades passed, and it wasn't until the 70s where two intrepid professors from George Mason University decided we're going to find this lost stuff, and went on a hunt, found the one old guy still alive at the Library of Congress who sent them to an abandoned airport hangar outside
Airplane
of
hangar.
Baltimore,
Yeah,
and there, covered with pigeon droppings, were crate after crate that
yeah,
held these treasures, the playbooks, the posters, the communications of the Federal Theater.
yeah, yeah.
Otherwise, neither you nor I could have written our stories.
Right. And it's such a rich archive, there's more to tell about it, even with our two books, and there are things in your book that I didn't know about. Uh, so it's it's a wonderful, wonderful experiment um, with a sad ending.
The
Um,
sad ending, not just for the Federal Theater, but do you want to tell
right,
Hallie's sad
right.
ending, or should I?
Well, I'm not sure about our time, but I think we haven't talked about one third of a nation and the living newspapers, and that was I think maybe the most important single innovation of the Federal Theater Project. And there were these vast casts that did plays about current events.
And they were fact checked. Every fact
Yes,
was
they
checked.
had a whole staff of journalists working on the
And when the
content.
congressman complained about what was in there, Hallie Flanagan said, "We were just quoting you."
Yes.
No. So
Well, that turned out, yeah, that was then turned into an incident where congressmen read um, passages from one third of a nation on the floor of the House and read them mockingly and contemptuously.
yes.
And then there was some rebuttal, but in the end, I think that as often happens, the contemptuous people kind of won the debate, and it was not good for the Federal Theater. But that was about what they read was about one third of a nation and about various wealthy interests, including the church, who owned vast tracts of land in New York and who
And for
controlled
those not familiar with this play, which
lots of real
really ought to
estate.
be restaged, one third of a
Yeah,
nation is a phrase that comes from an FDR speech where he
yeah,
speaks of one third of a nation underfed, underhoused. And it's a play about substandard housing.
yeah,
And the play amazingly begins in its New York production and ends with a fire in the house, which you don't often see going to a play.
right.
And in Philadelphia, because of the construction of
Yeah.
box homes in that town, they changed the story to fit a Philadelphia story. A black woman was the protagonist instead of a Jewish man. The Federal Theater
And they
understood
also, it begins and ends with the collapse rather than with a fire, because there's
this.
been a recent incident of a collapsing of housing in
And
Philadelphia. I love that.
it actually led to housing reform in Pennsylvania.
Did
So
it?
this
Yeah,
it did.
yeah,
How could it not? So congressmen were not happy about theater holding their
yeah,
feet to the
yeah.
fire.
Right. And there were comments that are very, very similar to comments now about who lived in this housing, this slum housing. Not real Americans, but foreign people, people from elsewhere, not us, you know.
Well,
Um,
happily, that's not an issue in contemporary America.
yeah, right.
Should we open it up to audience
Yes.
questions?
Yeah. I was just thinking, you reminded me of this recent raid on a couple of high rises in Chicago. Uh,
Absolutely,
uh,
absolutely.
it's right out of the Federal Theater playbook. Yes,
Susan,
playbook.
Thank you so much. This has been a really, really great conversation. There are some questions, and I'd like to just put them out there, and you can take turns, maybe trying to answer them. Um, for starters, the Federal Theater Project was accused of promoting propaganda. Is that how you would describe it?
Susan, you want to tackle
Oh,
that one?
okay. Well, interestingly, that word propaganda was used differently then by Harry Hopkins and by Hallie. And they saw propaganda as a good thing, giving people information about what was truly happening. It's come to be much more negatively viewed now. But Dyes and his committee What they didn't like was the kind of information that was being that was being provided to ordinary people. That was one of the things Hallie said often. We're giving ordinary people the information they need to fight back, you know, and that's exactly what is most threatening now to this right-wing Trump crowd.
Everything was factual. And Arthur Miller, for one, thought this was
Yeah.
the greatest contribution of the Federal Theater. The
Hmm.
fact-checked, extraordinarily detailed plays.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I was about to run out of juice here. One second.
Oh,
Okay. Um, so a couple other questions. You clarified the part about the 1/3 of a nation. And Congress apparently was kind of an audience for that. Do you think that was the intended audience?
For one, don't. I think that those responsible for putting these plays together didn't really expect their plays to be quoted back at them in congressional hearings. That just wasn't on the table. What they were
right.
doing was writing plays about things that were in the news. The whole idea of a kind of theater that was like a newsreel but with live actors telling the
Yeah.
story
Yeah.
was this great innovation. It had some European origins, but it was a pretty American phenomenon. And I think they steered a little too close to trouble and vilifying senators and members of Congress. And the federal theater paid a pretty brutal price for that. I should say the congressmen were more up in arms about interracial dating at the federal theater. A
Yes.
lot of things
Yeah,
that
that
was just
we
transgressive about this.
right. Right. One of my theses, and I think yours too, James, is that the underlying issues for the Dice Committee really had to do with race. It was a deeply, deeply felt racism on the part of the committee. That was what really worried them. And they couldn't, he had to kind of play it a little bit carefully in Congress because, not everybody came from the South. But that was the underlying concern. And it came up for a number of reasons. One was that the casts were integrated, as were the audiences. It was a requirement of the federal theater, and when that didn't happen, for instance, in Cincinnati, in one instance, and many others, they didn't play. They didn't open. So this is a powerful message, and really way ahead of its time. It's amazing to me to learn that there were theaters in New York City that weren't integrated.
One of the sadder chapters in my book is about a play called Liberty Deferred, written by two young black playwrights, which once congressional pressure heated up, Hallie and her staff slow walked. And they slow walked it because this was a play that actually was about things like lynching at a time where FDR could not get through Congress because of Southern resistance, an anti-lynching bill. So the politics at the time bumped up against the progressivism of this theater.
One of the witnesses at the hearings was a woman named Sally Saunders. That was actually her acting name. I've learned from James, um, who testified about she was working in a cast that was integrated, and she testified that one night one of the black actors asked her out. That was her testimony. That was the shocking testimony of this woman. And the
Mm,
committee
yeah.
came back with saying, "Well, did you speak to the director?" And she said, "Well, I certainly did." And that director said to me, "He has as much right to the life, liberty, and happiness as anybody else." This to us, this sounds like a perfectly legitimate response, but it was shocking to the committee.
And she was going to take it right to a senator in Mississippi.
Yes, and I think she did. Yeah.
She did indeed.
Um, So that gives you an idea of the underlying racism that really, really was I think the prime motivating factor in the attack on the Federal Theater.
Am I hearing echoes of DEI?
Or
Oh,
even of the young
echoes.
Republican memos back and forth filled with the most rancid accounts of blacks and Jews and others,
Yeah,
the more things change.
yeah,
Yeah, exactly. So I have a question about the Dice Committee. They accuse Flanagan of harboring communists in the Federal Theater. Did they have any evidence of that to support it, or is it just part of the playbook that we're seeing again today?
I'm happy to tackle that first, Susan, and then you can join in. First of all, you were not allowed to ask any employee, Hallie Flanagan wasn't, what their political beliefs were. Second, it was not illegal then as now to be a member of the Communist Party in the United States of America. And more complicatingly, if that's a word, a greater complication was that there were people who were really radical in the federal theater, as there are in any theater world. Theater tends to attract people who want to change the world, including those on the extremes. And Hallie Flanagan had her hands full trying to keep these people from presenting a theater that didn't speak to all Americans. And I think she was largely successful, but the committee nipped at her heels when there was any kind of overstepping.
yeah. And I'll just add that that being a communist in 1930 was different than now, or even we've been through all of these various the McCarthy era and so on, but it was a time of great turmoil and confusion, and the Nazis were dominating Europe, and communism seemed like a possible solution, and so there were communists, and Hallie herself was not a communist, but she was very attracted to the Russian theater and had spent more time there than in any other place. This was one of the things the Dies Committee pointed out to her. But that didn't make her a communist. It made her somebody who understood where the action was, and the action was at that point in Russia. So that got confused, as it always has, with being communist.
Yeah, that's a perfect answer.
Um, you talked a little bit about the Sinclair Lewis play, It Can't Happen Here.
Yeah.
Um, Seems pretty timely. What was the reaction when the Federal Theater first performed it in 1936?
Well, it performed it everywhere. So more attention, I think, went to the fact that it had opened in 21 cities and also to the differences. Each company was allowed to change the play to suit their audiences.
Mhm.
And spoiler alert, the play ends with a gunshot. So who fired the gun? Did the gun hit its target? Then as now, different parts of the United States have different views of gun control and gun use, and
Mhm.
directors made use of those local variations.
Mhm.
I think people were shocked at a story based in rural Vermont about how easy it was to turn the United States of America into a fascist country. And anybody who's been alive and reading the newspapers for the last 3 months will understand how audiences responded then.
Yeah.
Um, so one of the things that you talked about was what happened when the Federal Theater Project was shut down. Can you talk about like how did that go down?
Well, there were after the House had pretty much decided to discontinue the theater. There were hearings in the Senate, and there was a little glimmer of hope there, and a moment when all of the critics who had been pretty hard on the federal theater in the beginning, not without reason, came to its defense forcefully and eloquently. And Tallulah Bankhead came to the Senate and tried to seduce the senators into voting to support the federal theater. But in the end, but in the end they failed, and and they voted to end the funding, right, James? And then there were, oh, I mean, one of the most moving episodes was a final production of the puppet show Pinocchio, or the show Pinocchio, in which the act Pinocchio at the end of the story turns into a real boy. But after the Congress voted to end the federal theater, they changed the ending of the play, and they had him re- go back into being Pinocchio with his long nose, and then he dies, and he's put into a casket on stage and then carried off ceremonially. Thus endeth the federal theater.
And photographs of that wooden Pinocchio circulated across the land. That was the end of the
Yeah,
Federal Theater.
yeah, it would not without its dramatic touch.
Hallie
Touch.
Flanagan herself went back to Poughkeepsie, to Vassar, wrote a remarkable book called Arena in 1940 about the Federal Theater. A few years later, got Parkinson's disease,
Yeah.
and her second husband had died at this point of a heart attack. She believed caused in part by the pressures of the politics that shut down her enterprise. And she was put in a home where she heard voices in the hallway calling her a communist and the like. And it's a very sad end to a very promising chapter in American history.
Um, is there anything today that exists that was inspired by the Federal Theater Project in terms of the satirizing those in power, criticizing those in power? Is there, I'm thinking the San Francisco Mime Troupe, for example, which annually puts on these very topical street theater, essentially. Are there other troops out there that are trying to keep this alive?
If you've ever taken a chainsaw and chopped down a tree and gone back 6 months or a year later, you see shoots come up. Um, they're just shoots. They're nothing as substantial as that tree trunk that was there. I think you can look across the land and see traces of the public theater in efforts to bring theater to underserved communities, in touring companies that put on kids shows. But we're talking about reaching 1 in 4 Americans with theater that was either free, it cost a nickel or a dime at the time. And that has never been reproduced.
James, you work in the theater, and right now we're seeing so much pressure and discrimination of librarians are being demonized in our culture. And are people in the theater feeling that same kind of pressure?
Well, in every enterprise I'm involved with, as I'm sure the two of you are involved with, whether it's being a writer or a theater practitioner or a teacher or professor, the current administration is gutting support. It's just gutting it, whether it's special education or the NEA or NEH. So um, there is a commitment to fight to maintain our institutions and promote our values. But right now, it's a losing battle, and it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of votes to restore for the next generation what the three of us have been able to, and audience members have been able to enjoy. And I greatly fear that it's much harder to restore something that's been destroyed. That it just is not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
And the slashing of budgets for the arts in this country is just takes a day or two to enact and takes years to reverse.
Is there anything that you're aware of that is also comparable to what we're experiencing now? I'm thinking about, sort of the takeover of the Kennedy Center, which is our national theater to the extent that there is one. And we haven't yet really seen the consequences of that, but um, it strikes me as worrisome when the government that we have now starts to take over the voices of the theater.
I couldn't agree
Yeah.
more.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I just think the kind of ignorance of the House Un-American Activities Committee when they attack the federal theater is comparable to the ignorance of Donald Trump taking over the Kennedy Center, and nothing good can come of it. And I feel for all of the wonderful cultural institutions of Washington and of our whole nation now, where the difficult stories are not being told, they're being edited out. And telling the difficult stories was one of the things the Federal Theater did very well. One of their plays was about syphilis, and in their typical fashion, of kind of hands-on, the productions included a table out in the lobby area with a nurse behind it, giving shots
Oh,
to people.
interesting.
Yeah.
But you
Uh,
said,
so,
go ahead.
this was about informing the vast um, general public of informing Americans as well as employing them, and now we're disinforming them.
Mhm.
I think that when I wrote the book before Donald Trump was reelected, I believe that the National Endowment for the Arts would have been protected because one of the lessons that was learned by those in the theater world and in Congress who wanted to support the arts was make sure every congressional district gets some money. Don't
Mhm.
let it be restricted to 29 states. And the NEA made sure every congressional district got money. And yet, this Congress has slashed the budget for the NEA and for the NEH. So uh, I didn't expect what we are witnessing to be as severe. The book begins really saying there are seven New Deal enterprises that are still in existence. And it's no longer seven. If I ever come out with a new edition, I'll have to make that six or five or four. So it's
Yeah.
not just theater that's being challenged, but to circle back to the beginning of this program, there's been an effort since FDR established the New Deal to destroy the New Deal, to roll back every aspect of it. And by that, I even mean Social Security and all the other safeguards that were established back in the 20th century. And there are those in this country who want to deny Americans these fundamental services. It's not just theater, it's not just writing programs, it is essential economic programs. So, anybody listening to this who cares about preserving Social Security and national labor boards and the like, they're being destroyed and they're being threatened, and they will continue to be unless enough Americans stand up and say, this is not okay.
And I might add that the Living New Deal, by celebrating these projects and keeping them alive and keeping the memory alive of what was accomplished, it really is an antidote uh, to all of this erasure of our such important creative efforts.
Absolutely. It's God's
Yeah,
work. Yeah, very important.
yeah. It's
We only have a couple minutes left, but I wanted to ask you what you think is the legacy of the theater project? What lasting impact? You said that it didn't really aspire to change Congress or influence Congress, but what do you think the legacy is of the project?
James,
I think
yours.
I'd like to give an upbeat answer. The legacy of the story that I've told in the playbook is their playbook beat our playbooks. That the progressives didn't take seriously enough how easily this sort of enterprise that spoke to the needs of so many millions of Americans could be destroyed. And I think the legacy is we have to protect and fight for the New Deal programs that are still in existence. And we have to fight and protect ourselves against the ravages of AI. Which is destroying creative industries left and right. And we have to learn to come up with better playbooks than their playbook. So if I have any takeaway from that, it is that the Martin Dyes of this world, people thought were jokes, even as they thought Donald Trump was a joke. And now our country is in his hands. So all I can say is a renewed sense of what one values and what one is committed to, and what one feels is fundamentally American has to be rearticulated and supported by writers and artists and historians and biographers.
We have to keep alive the history of these wonderful New Deal projects, and eventually we'll get a better leadership, I hope, that can bring back some of this.
And there are Hallie Flanagans across the land, and we have to empower them.
Yes.
Well, thank you. This has been a really wonderful conversation. I'm really grateful that you agreed to do this tonight. And I want to thank everyone who's out there and listening to us for tuning in and for your support. We have another webinar coming up on November 11th with Richard Ha, who's the author of Leon Bible, Forgotten Artists of the New Deal. And we hope to see everybody then. Meanwhile, please take care, and thank you so much for this wonderful conversation tonight.
Thank you,
Onward.
Susan. And it was an honor speaking with you as well, Susan.
Thank you so much.
I feel the same way.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. That was fun.